Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. Well, if you're in most parts of Australia, it's this evening. Anyway, if you're joining us from somewhere else, it might be a different time zone. But I'm Robyn Ewing, and I co-direct the Create Centre with Professor Michael Andersen, who sends his apologies this evening. Before we have the wonderful webinar tonight that I know we're in store for with Ursula, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to our First Nations Australians. The University of Sydney is on Gadigal country. You might like to put your own acknowledgement in the chat. I'd like to acknowledge as well that the land was never ceded. But I'd also like to acknowledge that our First Nations Australians put story and the arts at the centre of their knowing, doing, being and becoming. And I feel that we have so much that we can learn from that approach to our lives, to our learning, to our curriculum. Now, it's my privilege to introduce our strategic Programs Manager, Thomas DeAngelis, who's going to introduce Ursula.
Thank you, Robyn. Yes, my great pleasure to be here this evening. And for those of you joining us, the Create Centre runs these webinars more or less once or twice a month. There won't be any webinars for the rest of this year. This is our last webinar, but by no means the least. And it's our great pleasure to welcome academics, artists, thinkers, and eminent Australians, or even eminent people that aren't Australian, to these webinars because we get a deep insight into their work and their practice. And it's a great pleasure to be able to share that with our Create Centre community. The Create Centre, our broad remit is to explore the relationship between learning, creativity, and the role of the arts in education, health, and wellbeing. And it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Ursula Dubosarsky, who I gather wanted to be a writer from the age of 6. And as a person who also writes for theatre, I write for theatre, it's much less a question of when you started writing and much more a question of when you weren't, I think, when you decide to be a writer. Ursula has won 9 Premier's Literary Awards and the Children's Book Council Award, the Book of the Year Award, and has been nominated internationally for both the Astrid Lindgren and Hans Christian Andersen Awards. Just as a little plug on her behalf, given that we're coming up to Christmas, there's a beautiful new edition of The Reindeer's Christmas Surprise, illustrated by Sue De Gennaro, which is out at the moment. This book was originally created for the David Jones Christmas Windows, and I have had the pleasure of reading it to a nephew, and it is a beautiful book. Ursula's work has been published widely throughout the English-speaking world and translated into 15 different languages. She was the Australian Children's Laureate in the years 2020 and 2021. So it's our great pleasure to welcome Ursula here, and I now hand over to Robyn and Ursula, who will be having a conversation about her work. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, Thomas. Ursula, can I just start by congratulating you on a wonderful and outstanding career in writing? And I think Thomas has touched on, some of your amazing achievements. So we're very honoured to have you here with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Robyn and Thomas. And, I'm delighted to be able to take part. I'm feeling very honoured too. So we're both honoured. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I'm obviously aware I'm going to be interrogated by a very distinguished person. So I'm really looking forward.
Well, as Thomas said, we have read that you wanted to write from such an early age. I wonder if you might like to tell us a little bit about that beginning, where you started, why you started, how you started.
Well, it's a deep mystery in the end, isn't it? But I understand, I think what Thomas was saying, that it's sort of somehow so much part of you, it's more like trying to pinpoint when you didn't want to. Certainly, I was actually a little bit late in life learning to read and write, not that late, but, I was well into year 1. So I remember learning to read. And I remember at the same time thinking, oh, wow, now I can read all those stories I make up in my head. I can write them down, and somebody else will be able to understand them. Whereas, before, like all children, before I could actually write, I used to pretend to write. And, there was some absolute compulsion of whatever I was making up in my head to sort of make it, I suppose, there must have been some desire to make it last, or not just to make it last, actually. I think it's more to do with, it's an act of communication, that you wanted somebody else to sort of know what was in your head. And in a way, I think I was thinking about this just last night. I was listening to a radio program that was about, children's literature. And there was a woman there who was some sort of expert, who was talking about, I suppose, what you'd call small children's sort of creative reading, or creative response to being read to. And she used as an example a little boy who wanted to be read over and over again, The Three Little Pigs. And after a while, his parents said, why are you so interested in this story? He was not able to read himself, so he was quite little. And he just said to them, it's about us, first, yeah. Mum, you used to live in a house of straw, and that was no good. So you went and found this house of wood where Dad was, and that was no good. So then you found this house of stones, and that's where I was. And then that was very good. So what was sort of fascinating about that was the child, in response to the story, is actually sort of writing their own story, and, you're constructing another, and I suppose a writer is a person who, in that response, decides to write it down so that it can sort of pass it on for someone else then to recreate another kind of meaning out of what you've written. So I guess I think what I'm trying to say, blah, 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 is the two impulses of, reading and writing, or listening to stories and making up stories, are sort of just absolutely the same impulse in a way. And the mystery is why some people decide they want to write those private responses down and make somebody else listen to them. So I don't know why. All I know is I certainly did grow up in a house with lots of books, and my mum was a librarian, and there was a sense that the books were a part of life. So obviously that must have some kind of influence on what you think you should do with your time. And I suppose, but it's interesting that it very early on was absolutely to do with writing. I mean, I was everybody says they were a shy child, so I suppose all children are shy. That's so, I was a shy child. So it sort of sometimes puzzles me that I've chosen this kind of public life, because really a writer, nobody's pushing you to get your books published for other people to read. So there's obviously some uninhibited or extroverted part in every writer, however sort of neurotic and shy they might think they are. So that must be something to do with it as well. Perhaps it's a form of acting, something like that.
Yeah. No, I really like as well what you said about also you want someone else to know what was in your head, but also it reminded me of Foucault's statement that we write to know what we didn't know before, that it can be a way of working things out.
Oh, 100%. And in a way, I guess that's the little boy with the three little pigs. He was trying he was sort of trying to discover something. And I think when you read for all sorts of reasons, but discovery is definitely a huge part of the impulse. And absolutely with writing is you want to know what you think. Because in a way, until you write it down, you feel as if you don't know, until you start telling those stories or retelling the stories to yourself and kind of construct, the great chaos of emotional life that we're all subject to. In sort of reading and writing are certainly ways you can try and understand them or make them meaningful. Yeah. Feeling some sort of mastery, I suppose.
Yeah.
About I mean, actually, sorry, this is a slight diversion, but there's a book I did with Andrew Joyner, a picture book called Too Many Elephants in This House, about a little boy with all these chaotic, terrible, out of control elephants that his mother keeps telling him he's got to, get rid of them. And he finds a way to kind of control them. He sort of, makes a house and puts them in it. And then whenever he wants to play with them, he just knocks on the door and they all come bursting in all their sort of vigor. And, there's a level of fear about their completely uncontrolled sort of joie de vivre that he doesn't control. And I suppose that when I look at that, I often think that book is kind of about the imaginative life and how do we control that. Control is, we don't look at it as necessarily a very positive word, but it's a kind of necessary way of getting through life, isn't it? Our emotions are and children's emotions are so volatile and extreme and profound and out there that I think through imaginative literature is a way of kind of harnessing them, not banishing them or not taking the vitality out of them, but in a way just kind of learning to tame them or understand them so they don't overwhelm you.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because I think with young children, their imaginative world and, if you like, the actual real world, there's not a clear boundary often. So that's really interesting.
And how interesting, Robyn, that is partly what you look. I was at an event in Parramatta a couple of weeks ago, and somebody was talking about children's responses to reading, that over a long period these various women had kind of observed their own children's responses to stories. And it was so interesting that according to sort of each individual child, but there was definitely one child who repeatedly needed the reassurance that this is not real. That other children didn't require that, but certain children totally needed to know where that boundary was. And I guess that is partly what you're doing when you're reading and writing, and you're working out where those boundaries are. And I guess all writers, probably everybody, but if we're talking about writing, are aware of that kind of, that the way it all becomes a bit blurred.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's what it needs to be to create something. It sort of needs to be blurred,
So
interestingly, sorry, I was just going to say, in that thing, one child was saying it's not real, and it was interesting. There was another child that would just get right into the story, and when the threatening monster would arrive, would kind of interfere and sort of put themselves in there and describe how they would conquer the monster. Like, there's just so many sort of different approaches to the story, I suppose, that each, and maybe writers are more into the getting in there and changing the storyline or something like that. And that's probably just anxiety,
Okay. Well, one of the descriptors that you use to describe the imaginative process and the creative process, it's that it's tangled. And that really interested me. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that tangled upness.
Yes, look, often when I talk to children about, writing and planning and all that sort of thing, the image that comes into my mind is this terrible scribble pattern. And that's what it feels like, just this sort of terrible kind of scribble that I don't know if you have to untangle it exactly, but you know, with scribble patterns, you color in bits and you sort of create a pattern. It's certainly, I'm not, and I think I'm not 100% sure, but I think of the statistics, but I think an awful lot of writers are like me in that they're not very good at planning their story. Some people are very good at it, but I think a lot of writers are not, and I'm definitely one of the ones that are very poor at it. And I don't seem to be able to think about my stories theoretically, if you know what I mean. I don't seem to be able to kind of work out what's going to happen unless I'm sort of right in the middle of it emotionally. Yeah. So you do get very, I suppose here I'm talking more about novels. Look, with picture books, my experience of picture books, that if you hit a tangle, then that's just death, like if it hits a kind of terrible tangle. I've never been able to get through a tangle of a picture book text, like a sort of, this isn't working. I find it just, then it never works. That there's something kind of, I'm not quite sure why, that's just my personal experience. There's something sort of light and delicate about a picture book that just doesn't seem to lend itself to hammering away at detangling it. But with novels, I'll just kind of launch my way into it. It's a bit like you just have an intuition about something that you've seen or thought of or heard or whatever it is that makes you interested in writing a particular story. And you don't know what's inside it, but you have a funny kind of, instinctively that there's enough in there, or there in fact is usually there's too much in there that will keep you going, but you don't know what it is. So I suppose that's the kind of the tangly darkness of it, that you just have to somehow trust. It gets easier after you've written the first novel because you've done it before, so you think, well, I can do it again. But each time it really is a kind of a thrusting forward into a kind of tangle of unknowns, and you certainly do hit bad spots, and then you have to go back and start all over again. I mean, this is the downside of not planning. It's really interesting. I notice my sister is part of the audience here, and I'm just about to quote or to cite an event that we went to a few years ago at the Mildura Writers Festival, which I can recommend to anyone if they haven't been. It's quite a small festival. And David Malouf was one of the speakers at an event we went to. And he was very, distinguished and grand and so on. And it was quite a small audience because it's a small festival. And somebody put up their hand and said, what do you do when you have a writer's block? And at first he said rather loftily, I felt, I just put it in a drawer for 5 years. And I thought, well, great. That's a very self-confident writer. But then he said, what I do, and I actually think this is absolutely got something in it. He said, what I do is I go back to the very first paragraph I wrote, and all the answers are in there. And I happened to be in a terrible tangle with a novel of mine called The Blue Cat at the moment. We were at the Mildura Writers Festival. And I thought, well, how fascinating. And I went back and I did look at the very first paragraph he wrote. And, he was perhaps speaking, in a kind of hyperbolic way, but there was an awful lot of truth in what he said, that whatever it was that you get stuck in a tangle because you've sort of lost your way of what you were trying to say, or you've been distracted, or you've forgotten, or you don't know what you were trying to say, but you've taken a wrong path or something like that. But if you go back to that very first paragraph, it's not at all explicit. But it somehow, with The Blue Cat, it definitely was all there. I just looked at it and I thought, yes, that's what it's about. So I suppose writing for me has always just been complete trial and error, and again, I'm sure that's not uncommon with writers. It's just your brain is such a, full receptacle of many things. So you just have to somehow find your way. I always really liked that phrase of Graham Greene. Again, it's a bit of an exaggerated phrase, but he said something like, all writing is remembering, like you've already written it. You just have to try and remember it. And I sort of know what he means there as well. You have some, that's the intuition. You feel that you know what that story is. It's just that you've forgotten it. And so you're struggling to remember it. The act of writing is somehow trying to remember it.
Yeah. That's so interesting. So is that one of the joys of writing imaginatively for you, that it helps you remember what you wanted to say or explore?
Look, I think look, it's funny when I'm writing for young children, so picture books or even, I suppose, chapter books. It's almost completely a joyful experience. Like, it's very, very joyful. And after I spend a morning's writing something like that, I look in the mirror and there's this happy lady looking back at me. With my novels, it's actually it's obviously drawing on something else, because joy is not quite the word. I suppose it's more like fear, actually. And I rarely read from my novels aloud because I find it too stressful. Like, what have I said? And after I've had a morning's writing one of my novels, when I look in the mirror, like, I look like I've been through some very traumatic experience, like really ugly and pale and just sort of so with the novels, it's not exactly joyful, but it's satisfying, I suppose, at some level. It's a slightly, I don't quite know. I'm very, very glad to have written them. I'm writing a novel at the moment and I want to write novels. So it's just, we were talking a little bit before about writing across the age groups. And I was saying that quite a lot of children's writers, even though they're, quite different artifacts, do write things for different ages. And I think my experience, again, is probably quite common. I started out writing novels, and then when I had children of my own, I kind of went back to picture books because I was surrounded by them, and I suddenly started thinking about them, and I suddenly started getting ideas for them. So, and I feel, certainly in terms of, I don't know, the feeling of achievement of your writing, there's certainly, look, if anything, I probably, the great thing about a picture book is there's so few words. You can be so perfectionistic, like every word can be just the right word. And so you have this intense sort of satisfaction that you're approaching what you hoped for. Whereas novels are so messy and imperfect. And, that's another reason why I find them very difficult to read aloud, because I just want to keep crossing things out. I just say, you want to keep correcting them. Whereas with the picture books, I feel, I've
more complete, or
it's more, there's not such a discrepancy between the idea and the fact, if the achievement or whatever.
So in a sense, novels are a bigger challenge, or perhaps a bigger challenge.
It's funny, isn't it? Because the thing about any sort of writing is it's not to say that one is sort of more of a challenge or it's not that difficult to write something that's not very good. Do you know what I mean? Like, we can all write something that's not very good. So I suppose I feel the challenge is the same, like, because you don't want to write something that's not very good. So it's just I suppose it's just a very different kind of challenge, and you don't know that you've got it in you, I guess, until you try. And, you know, I have many failures. So
Well, lots of successes too.
yes, look, that's true. And I think what I was going to say before I just got sidetracked by myself was that with a novel, you can fix it up. You can go back to it and nut out those tangles and work at it. It's sort of more malleable. Whereas I find with a picture book, you work at it and it just crumbles in your hand. It's just all gone. Whereas with a novel, you know, in that way, like it's sort of harder labor, but if you keep working at it, you feel pretty confident that you'll get there. So I suppose that makes the challenge of a picture book really is recognizing if is admitting whether it's working or not. Sometimes it's just, you know, you want it to be good. And I mean, sometimes you actually don't. I mean, this is the fascinating thing, and I'm sure any writers in the audience will know this, that or readers for that matter, but you can never really predict. I'm talking about picture books now, how successful or how well a picture book will work for an audience or an individual child until it's sort of out there and you're reading it to them. And it's always fascinating the points at which, you know, any group almost will inevitably burst into laughter at a certain thing, which when I wrote it, was not aware that it was funny. But now, of course, I'm aware, so I'm ready for the laugh. But that's the wonder of the reader, isn't it? So I don't know what that's all about, that, you know, you think something was terribly, well, not serious, but, you know, you just weren't aware that it was funny. And I guess laughter is a very palpable, easy response. Like when people laugh, we know they think it's funny. Whereas with children listening, I mean, the wonderful thing, of course, about reading to, you know, random crawling, you know, inattentive children in a classroom or a library or wherever they, it's sort of, that's a very beautiful moment when finally they're all with you, you know, that it takes them a little while or whatever. And that's intensely satisfying, I suppose, that act of communication. You feel you're really communicating. Whereas I guess with novels, you just never know. It's a sort of secret activity. So you can only hope for the best. And look, you do get people writing to you or telling you, but it's not quite the same as that immediate kind of performance that you get, response that you get with picture books.
Yeah. Well, I just thought, I mean, I've got some other questions, but Laurie has made an interesting comment in the chat about word spy.
Oh,
Laurie, I wondered if you wanted to ask a question or
I'd
make
love to.
oh,
yeah,
great.
thank you. Thank you, Ursula. Hello. It's so wonderful to meet you and to be here today. But I've got both of your books here, and I want the third one, and it's out of print everywhere.
I know.
So I don't know how I
know
can get
it's
it.
sort of really. I mean, I've got one copy here. Where is it? It's somewhere. The Word Spy activity book. Well, I thought I had it. It's kind of sad that I don't. Just in case other people don't know. Well, Laurie, you can tell them what they are. I guess.
Well, the Word Spy is all about the history of the English language. It's in student speak, so it's engaging. We've targeted stage 2 with these texts, specifically this one, and it talks about morphology and etymology. So spelling is a big focus, but also punctuation is a great focus as well. And you put it in this lovely, engaging story, and it's wonderful. Yeah. Yes,
and it's sort of got lots of white space and lots of illustrations. So I think also as a piece of design, I think it was extremely designed. Oh, it's upside down. Sorry, by Toby Riddle and illustrated by Toby Riddle. And I do think it's, you know, sometimes when I'm in the library, and you know, you pick up a book and you just think, sometimes, sorry, this is a terrible thing to say. Sometimes the contents are not that great, but the design is so fantastic. You just think, well, that book is a triumph of design. Like any child will enjoy that book, and that is not the case of the Word Spy. The contents are excellent. But indeed, the design is an absolutely, you know, vital part of the act of communication of this book. And the return of the Word Spy is not very imaginatively named, Return of the Word Spy, but they're told they are non-fiction, but they're told from the point of view of this character, the word spy. So they're sort of told in the first person. So it's got a kind of fictional elements. And then this is the elusive, the word spy activity book, which was, you know, a book that you to write in and draw in, and I don't know the publishing history of this book, but it seems to me either very, very few are published, or they lost confidence in it incredibly quickly because it just sort of disappeared. But I get asked about it quite often, so I have every sympathize. I'm always looking out for it on eBay and A-books and things like that, but it just never comes up.
No. And this one, the second one, is more like traditional grammar, isn't it? Like we see a lot about functional grammar, but you're looking at traditional grammar, which we've
yes, so that's right. So this one is more about, you know, well, the traditional words that you might, this one is more about traditional grammar, and as you say, so it's sort of, they're like a pair in the way, and they're essentially about English, but in a way they're about language altogether, aren't they? And I must say, because now I've been sort of publishing and writing for 30 years, you know, there are certain titles that, you know, that come up again and again, and these ones have certainly been very, they hit a spot somewhere. And I suppose for books of this age group, I've certainly got as many, probably more male fans than female fans even, whereas my other novels are probably it's more the other direction, if you know what I mean. But it's funny, you know, when I left university, I said to myself, well, that's over and I'll never have to write another footnote again in my life. I will only ever write fiction, because I just found it so stressful, you know, having to check that everything you said was true. You know, it's a real drag. So I must say, when it happened that, you know, through a series of sort of, you know, accidents, developments, that I came to write these books, you know, it was quite true. It is a great drag to have to make sure that everything is true. But what was the sort of really delightful challenge of these books is I suppose you either wanted to underestimate or overestimate the reader. So it was to do with this, you know, child has only been in the world for 9 years. So there is just a limit to certain things that they're going to know, and which is nothing to do with their intelligence or their receptiveness or their imagination or anything like that. It's just simply, you know, how long you're alive. So in that way, I couldn't, you know, you had to be careful not to overestimate what they might know, but then terribly important not to underestimate what they might know or what they might want to know. So it was almost, and it needed to be simple, but it needed to be true. And that's an enormous challenge, because truth is complicated, you know.
I just want to say some of the puzzles at the end of each chapter are quite challenging. I couldn't get them all.
Well, because at the end of each chapter, there's a sort of a puzzle, and you sort of have fun. I have to say, Toby Riddle, the illustrator and designer, was really against the puzzles.
Oh, was he?
Didn't like the puzzles, because he thought what would happen is the kids would just go straight to the puzzle, and they would, you know, he worried about that. But my experience is that hasn't happened, because also in a way you need enlightenment from the book to work out the puzzle. So, but I think, and by the third book, he was in the third book, all the puzzles are about for children, how to solve cryptic crosswords.
Wow.
Yeah, that was fun, but it's unavailable.
I just want to say thank you. You're wonderful. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Well, I just thought, and there may well be some other questions in a minute, but I just thought you might like to share with us a little bit about being the Children's Laureate in the middle of a pandemic and lockdown, because that must have been a very different experience to what you were expecting.
Well, look, it's funny, I suppose, also because the Children's Laureate, if people don't know, it's a kind of reading promotion kind of figure that you become the laureate. You get chosen and you become the laureate for 2 years, and your kind of role is to get out there and fly around Australia and talk to as many children and adults as possible about, you know, the importance of reading. And yes, as Robyn says, you know, I think 2 weeks after I was made the laureate, we went into lockdown. And obviously the next 2 years, as everybody knows, was in and out. And so all those plans, including trips to Bologna in Italy to the Children's Book Fair and so on, all those sorts of plans were not every single one of them, because as soon as the lockdown broke, we'd go off and do something. But what it meant was, of course, like everybody in the entire world, we started communicating like this as we are tonight, which before COVID we may well not have, even though the technology was there. But we needed some sort of rupture to push us all through the portals. And so in some ways, so I got very used to, as everybody has, to talking to cameras and talking to children in this sort of situation and working out ways of making that work. And look, I think in a lot of ways I probably reached more kids, you know, because that's just a physical fact. So there was more things you could do. Look, yeah, it was fascinating. And I suppose all of that was part of a whole new way of being in the world. And of course, it also meant there was a lot more international communication.
Yes.
I think before COVID probably wouldn't have happened, you know. So we did several sort of international events as well via, you know, this sort of technology. So look, it was a curious couple of years, but it's hard to you know, it was a curious period in the world, wasn't it? So I certainly the only trip I did feel quite sad about was we were all booked and packed and ready to go up to Uluru, and that obviously would have been fantastic, and that did not happen. So, and that was I think it was quite a last minute kind of lockdown. It was in the second year, and it was just, that was very disappointing. All the other things would have been disappointing too, but I suppose that was just a particular event. It was a sort of rich and unusual year. The thing is, the Laureate in Australia's, you know, only been going, I suppose, for about 10 or 12 years. So it's discovering what it is as well. So I just felt, in a way, it was just part of that continuum. And my focus, each laureate is supposed to have a kind of I don't know, a goal or a theme, and mine was about joining your local library. You know, this wonderful free resource of endless books for every child in Australia, and you know, I think library membership is about 50%, but you know, which is pretty fantastic, but could obviously be 100%. And so I suppose I just felt that's what I wanted to focus on, that, you know, we have this public good that everybody can use, and you know, make going to the library as natural as going to your local pool kind of thing. Yeah. So that, and of course, because most of the libraries were shut, so that was a bit of a downer. But, you know, nonetheless, I was always very cheered. I live in Marrickville in Sydney, and I would drive past Marrickville Library, and there'd be this massive queue of people outside, many children with parents for their click and collect. You know, like it made you realise, I think, in some ways, how very people do rely on libraries a lot more than perhaps they realise. Like they're just and I suppose my argument about the library, not argument, but I guess what I felt was that with children and reading, you know, that whole the things, you can go into a library with a child and, you know, you can help them pick books, but you can just also kind of set them free to find books. And I guess it's that sense of discovering your own taste as a child. And you might borrow 6 books and they're all terrible, and then the next week you'll borrow another 6 you know, you have to get through the ones you don't like to find the ones you like, in a way. Whereas I think in a bookshop or buying a book, that, you know, if you get mum and dad to buy you a book and you don't like it, like, that's not a very, you know, they're not going to buy you another one, if you know what I mean. Whereas the wonderful freedom of the library is to, you know, as we all know, you know, there's billions of books out there, and so much of reading is about experimentation and discovery. So I guess that's what I felt was
for sure.
The most important thing about reading was kind of access to books, in a way.
Yeah. And we know how self-selection of books is so important, as you know, we know.
Exactly, that's right. In a sense of, you know, I know it's all a bit cliche, but, you know, ownership of your sort of, you know, that you're choosing it, in a sense, even if it's a bad choice. So I gave a speech to some girls, I think, when I said it was like a yum cha trolley, you know, like here's the yum cha trolley and just pick anything. You might not like that one, but, you know, you've tried it now, and then pick that one. Like, sort of look at it as this incredible, magnificent, certainly in Australia, we're, you know, incredibly good public library system. Like, it's fantastic. And, you know, we should all be using it.
Yes.
Especially for children, I think. Because that pleasure principle, sorry, I'm just speaking in truisms, but, you know, everybody here would know that, you know, no matter how often you tell children or adults for that matter, oh, you really should read, but, you know, the internal drive of pleasure, of wanting to read something, is fundamental. Yeah,
for sure. Lisa, you made a comment. We have the wonderful Lisa Shanahan here. Would you like to make that comment?
Hi, Ursula. So lovely to see you. I really loved the way you really collaborated as a laureate, the way we got to see you, you know, your illustrators that you had worked with, how they also were a part of that process. I thought that was just a really beautiful thing to see.
Oh, look, thanks, Lisa. Look, it was fantastic, wasn't it? Andrew Joyner and Toby Riddle both made posters and got involved. Toby and I did a book together, The March of the Ants, and I did some appearances with both Toby and Andrew. And I guess the thing about the laureate is, and I actually think when the next laureate comes, you're going to see a sort of expansion of this idea of rather than just sort of, yay, one writer, fabulous, you know, let's all celebrate this person. I think they're really trying to I don't know if democratize the word is, but sort of, you know, you have laureate events hosted by other writers and illustrators all across Australia. They can be laureate events during the time of a particular laureateship, but in a way they're kind of, you know, laureate ambassadors or something, I suppose. So to try and, I guess, broaden it out. And as you say, make it something more cooperative. It's really in its, you know, it's going through, well, I suppose it's past teething, but it's definitely, I think, really trying to work out what it's for, I guess, in the end. And I think, you know, they've had lots of tangles. And you know, I guess I was one of the tangles, and just hopefully we'll, you know, just go from strength to strength. But thank you for saying that.
Well, are there others who'd like to ask a question or make a comment? Beck?
Thank you, Robyn. Hi, Ursula. It's really lovely to listen to you, because The Word Spy, those two books, were a huge influence on my own daughter's reading. She just devoured them. She loved them because they were about language. And for her, that really, really resonated. So thank you for writing those, just, you know, from a parent. I'm really curious about your process when you're writing a picture book. And I know you were kind of talking, I've written it down, kind of the fragility that you find around writing a picture book. When you're writing or phrasing, are you kind of creating the images as you go? Like, is there kind of a way that they come together, or does one come first or later, or is it different for each book?
When you say images, do you mean, am I kind of imagining
the
look of
pictures?
the illustration?
Yeah.
Well, interestingly, see, I'm one of these people that don't have much visual imagination, I guess is the word. So when I'm writing anything, I don't see anything much.
Right.
Shadows, bit of movement, flash of light. And so actually this makes me quite desirable for illustrators because I can totally see, if you have a strong visual imagination, that when you are writing, you would be that would be part of your creation, what you saw in your head. And that might be hard to let go. Handed it over to an illustrator. But I don't really have a vision. And so I feel quite relaxed about handing it over to an illustrator. And then also it's an extremely sort of exciting kind of surprise when you see another person's just free flow of the imagination on what you've written. So that feels, that's a fantastic feeling, particularly as, you know, most writing is, it's just sort of you and your brain. So in a way, I wonder what I am doing then, because it's certainly not putting images together. I suppose it's ideas. I suppose it must be something like a string of ideas that I sort of, because I must assume that when you yourself write, you see something. Question. Yeah. So it's sort of, I mean, it's funny. I know when I was at school, particularly in primary school, and you'd be asked to do write a paragraph describing a bushranger or something like that. My best friend Janet, who was a very good writer, right, reams and reams. What a visual imagination! Fantastic. I just couldn't think of a thing to say. I just wasn't seeing anything.
Right.
So, yeah, so it's so, yes, I don't know if that's a very satisfactory answer.
No, that's a beautiful answer, because it's like you get the book back and it's almost another gift. It's always like being gifted back to you in another way. Yeah. No, that's a great answer. Thank you so much for sharing that.
No, pleasure. I mean, I just feel I know it is a difficulty with publishers and with writers and illustrators that they have this kind of clashes of expectations. So it's just the way my mind works. It just never arises. I should say sometimes, for example, I know in the Elephants book, for example, Andrew had done some fantastic illustrations of this very, depressed, annoyed mother with her vacuum cleaner and things like that. And when I saw that, I had a sense that I don't think we want the mother in this book, so it's a great illustration. So it's not like I don't have any opinion. And then it is fantastic. All you see of the poor mother is her little fingers around the door, like she's just trying to get in the room. So I do have opinions when I'm shown something. It's not as sort of bland as it's sounding, but I certainly don't have a vision.
Right. That's lovely.
But I guess then you sort of need to work with illustrators. I mean, with Andrew, I always felt from the very first illustration I saw that he did, I always felt at the school magazine, I always felt, oh God, if I could draw, I would draw like that. It's got to be some sort of, I suppose, for illustrators that you work well with, I guess there has to be some kind of essential.
So it is more of a collaboration in that way.
Yeah, must be some sort of understanding of how each other's mind works. So I'm never shocked by what he does. I'm just sort of like fascinated and delighted.
Lovely. Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
I think we might leave it there. I think we could talk all night, Ursula, but thank you so much for sharing your process and helping us understand a little bit about the way that you work and why it's important for you.
Well, look, thank you, Robyn and Thomas, and all you lovely Zoomers there, and questions are really appreciated. It's sort of, look, a bit like what we were saying right at the beginning. I always find in these sorts of discussions that you learn something about yourself that you didn't know before. So it's just a great forum to be able to have some back and forth with people. So I really appreciate your patience in listening to me. It's been fantastic.
We haven't needed patience. It's been great.
Oh.
We love your work and all the best for your future work. And thank you all for joining us. The YouTube version will be available soon, and you'll be able to share it with others as well. And if you haven't joined Create yet, have a think about it. Okay.
Fantastic organisation. Thank you. Bye, everyone.